Can you hear me? Terrific. I'm Peter Beinart. I'm a professor here at the Graduate Center, and it's my pleasure to be moderating this panel on the 2016 presidential campaign. A lot of people who don't have anything interesting to say a lot of stuff about the 2016 presidential campaign, but we actually have two people here who I think really have a lot of really interesting insights into the dynamics of this race. To my left, we have Joy Ann Reid, who is national correspondent for MSNBC and the author of the new book, Fracture, which you will be able to get copies of outside. She'll be signing at the end of this discussion. And Reihan Salam, who is executive editor of National Review, and many years ago, when he was just leaving junior high school, worked with me at the New Republic. We will talk for about an hour or so, depending on how things go, and then turn it over to you for questions. We might turn it over to you a little bit if the conversation seems to flag a little bit. Reihan, let me just start with you. A lot of people have tried to make sense of the fact that the two leading Republican candidates, Donald Trump and Ben Carson, are people who have not held elective office, are candidates who are viewed with some degree of alarm by the Republican Party establishment. We were raised, some of us, to think the Republican Party was hierarchical, orderly, would nominate the next person in line. What is your grand theory of this outsider surge inside the GOP?
Well, I think one thing that it's important for people to keep in mind is that if you look at all of the Western market democracies since 2008, since the financial crisis, have gone through a real political upheaval. And in a way, the United States has been quite insulated from this. You see tiny examples of, some kind of populist upsurge here and there, but really in Europe, it's been far more dramatic. In Italy, for example, you had a political party, the Five Star Movement, led by an Italian comedian that commanded, almost about a fifth of the vote. In Northern Europe, you have the Sweden Democrats, a party that began as a neo-fascist political party that now commands almost 25% of the vote in Sweden. And certainly in Denmark, the Danish People's Party, another kind of populist anti-immigration party, is part of the government now, and it's the second largest party. You see this in virtually every European democracy, and yet the United States has not, well, another good example, in Britain, you have UKIP, another political party that was a kind of populist outsider political party that commands 1 out of 7 votes and yet won only 1 seat, partly because of the nature of their electoral system. So, this is something that you've seen pretty much everywhere. Every party that's been in power since the 2008 financial crisis has met with some kind of ferocious resistance from some kind of outsider political movement. And these have taken all kinds of stripes. Some have come from the left, some have come from the right. And I think that in the United States, we're now finally starting to see some of this energy take form. And I think that Bernie Sanders on the left and Donald Trump and Ben Carson on the right represent this kind of energy.
So to stick with Carson and Trump, if there is a connection, you're suggesting there's a connection between the financial crisis and their rise. What is that connection? Kind of sketch it out for us.
So the financial crisis basically led to many people to just lose faith in the political establishment, in the conventional political parties. Now, you've seen some countries go kind of further along in that cycle than others, because you had some kind of populist political movements that were subsequently discredited. You had some places that have achieved greater stability. In the United States, Barack Obama was able to kind of capture a lot of that energy and enthusiasm in 2008, and he was able to kind of channel it in more or less a kind of conventional political direction. Barack Obama was someone who both seemed like a kind of fresh, new political figure, but he, generally speaking, came out of the kind of conventional center-left tradition of the party. Many people thought of him as very left-wing, but unlike a Bernie Sanders, he was not someone who was operating outside of the mainstream Democratic Party. He is not someone who openly characterized himself as a socialist, though, of course, there are many critics of his who did. On the Republican side, however, you had the Republican Party benefit from a kind of reactive wave. One thing that there's this really fascinating political scientist who has been tracking the kind of policy mood of the American electorate for a long period of time. People describe themselves ideologically as one thing, as conservative or liberal, but really, those ideological descriptions aren't always that useful. Basically, this study, what it did is it just asked you, do you think government should be bigger or smaller? And what these guys found is that the mood of the electorate is such that the American public has always been operationally liberal and ideologically conservative. Now, there are two periods of time when the public was a bit more ideologically conservative and also operationally conservative, and those have been during periods of government expansion. So under Obama, ironically enough, the public has been more conservative than it was during the Bush years. But that doesn't mean that the public is all that conservative, generally speaking. It just so happens that that was the case during the Bush years. So the Republicans were able to benefit from this kind of reaction to President Obama, but they weren't really capitalizing on it in any deep way. They were able to win elections in 2010 and 2014, but they weren't really able to articulate some larger domestic policy agenda, and they weren't really able to connect with the underlying anxieties that led many voters to come their way. So, again, they kind of lucked into the fact that they happened to not be in power during a time of great discontent, but they haven't actually capitalized on that. And so I think that that's why you have a lot of discontent among Republican voters.
And if I may, just to build on what Rehan was saying, I find it interesting to sort of contrast what is happening in Great Britain with UKIP and what's happening in the United States, because what you did have across much of particularly Western Europe after the Great Recession and the bank collapses that spread both here and in Europe was that the austerity party was in power and was the one who was charged with repairing the financial breach. And in Britain specifically, the Conservative Party essentially was dictating the substance of the fix, like what the fix was going to be, and it was austerity. And austerity, the reaction to it has been really severe, because what you've seen is a real curtailing of the social safety net in places like Great Britain, and you've had a really negative reaction to it. Whereas in this country, the austerity party was the out party. So I think you have an interesting sort of inversion of what was taking place in Great Britain, where the Democrats came in and their prescription for fixing the economic collapse was some austerity, because you had this push on the right to have austerity, to cut government, in much the way that was taking place, particularly in Great Britain, I'm thinking of. But you had a president who was on the other side of that argument, and so you had more limited austerity. So I do think you do have some residual energy, particularly on the left of the party, because liberals in the Democratic Party have been an outgroup within the Democratic Party for so long. There's been this project of more than really 40 years of trying to find a way to reel the party back in from what we're seeing as too much leftism, to bring it back to a center that was more center-right, something that Bill Clinton really built his political career on, successfully doing so, but that Jimmy Carter tried to do too in the 1970s. But now you have a lot of residual energy on the left that I think is being expended in the Bernie Sanders campaign, which is also sort of an offshoot of the Elizabeth Warren moment, which is an offshoot of the same kind of energy you saw in Occupy, the sort of great unfinished project of a lot of people on the left, where yes, we did have some reforms that were essentially progressive, even if not perfect, like healthcare reform. You didn't have the severe austerity that you had in Europe. But at the same time, the banks are still out there, and the banks were really unreformed in the minds of a lot of people who are in the Sanders wing of the party. And so I think it is interesting that you have seen the left come back in a huge way during the Obama era, and they've come back particularly on social issues like gay marriage and win on those issues, and actually not just win the day, but really win the argument, and really have the country sort of come in their direction. But there is this feeling that one of the great sort of unfinished projects that the left has in front of it in this resurgence is to deal with economic reform, to deal with economic fairness, and to deal with the wealth gap. And I think that's why you see so much energy. It's a different kind of populist energy. The energy on the right, I would argue, is partly about economic insecurity, which you can see whenever there's periods of economic insecurity, there is anti-immigration sentiment, there's those kind of sentiments bubble up, and I think that is part of it too. But it's also a a reaction to the cultural move left, I think, that the country has undergone. I think that's part of the appeal of Donald Trump, too. It's sort of reacting against the sort of politically correct multiculturalism of the Obama era. I think that's mixed up in it, too, but there is also obviously economic populism. But the third thing I'll say briefly is that I think it's also a reaction to the Republican Party and the way they've made their argument to their own base. They've argued that they can completely reverse the Obama era, that if you just give them the House and the Senate, they will reverse healthcare reform. They will reverse whatever things that Obama did. And since Barack Obama, the body of him, the person of him, is so offensive to so many people in the base of the Republican Party, the failure of Republicans to win, to just win when they're in arguments against him, I think has hurt them. And then the donor class of the Republican Party essentially telling its own base, not only are we not going to deliver on one of the things you're most insecure about, which is stopping illegal immigration, unlawful migration, we're actually going to tell you you're not even supposed to want that. We are going to tell you what's best for you, and that is we're going to do a comprehensive immigration reform. And that donor class breach with the base of the party, I think, is the third thing that's created this movement toward these out-group type of candidates.
You know, Rehan, I think a lot of liberals look at Trump, and maybe Carson too, and what's happening in the Republican Party, and say, okay, we know what's going on. Basically, there are a bunch of older white people who are really, really upset that the country is becoming more minority and that it's becoming pro-gay and that it's becoming more secular, and they just can't deal with the fact that it's not the 1950s anymore. And maybe there's some economic insecurity, but basically they just can't deal with 21st century America, and they're in revolt against and this political correctness thing is basically a way of saying, like, why can't we get it back to the old days when people like us were running everything, and when we represented the American norm? Now, I know liberals don't always entirely accurately perceive what's happening inside conservative circles, but I wanted to throw that out there because I think that is a idea, a meme that's out there on the left, and I wanted you to say to what degree do you think it has any merit and what it gets wrong.
Well, I think that it's important to keep in mind that the Carson phenomenon and the Trump phenomenon are in fact pretty distinct. They are definitely both outsider candidates, but Ben Carson has gained an enormous amount of support from lots of evangelical voters, religiously devout voters. In previous elections, many of these voters gravitated to Rick Santorum. They gravitated to Mike Huckabee, and even further back to, let's say, Pat Robertson. But this has long been a constituency within the party, and Ben Carson speaks to them. And I think there are lots of fairly understandable reasons why he does speak to them. He's someone who wears his faith on his sleeve. He's very articulate on these matters, and he's very passionate about them. Whereas Donald Trump, if you look at his support, it's pretty striking. His supporters. Actually, he's disproportionately supported by more moderate, self-described moderate Republican voters. He is supported by more secular Republican voters. And also, again, I want us to kind of zoom out and really think about this. So again, in Sweden, about 25% of the country backs this kind of anti-immigration, hard-right political party. In the United States, about 24% of the, let's say, 35% of people who identify as Republicans support Donald Trump. And of course, when we look at that, it's actually pretty striking because the number of Republicans who say they would never support Donald Trump under any circumstances is also quite high. And also, it's not clear how robust or durable that support for Donald Trump is as people get a better sense of who he is, what he's about. What I do think is absolutely right in what you've said is that immigration is the issue that Trump has, on which he's built a big constituency. It was one of many things that he brought up when he announced his campaign, but it's the one thing that really resonated, partly because there was such a sharp backlash to his remarks from the media, from the wider public. He just said a series of things that were really inflammatory, but I do think that it's true that the way that we talk about immigration, let's say at the elite level, versus the way that we talk about it at the popular level, I think that there's a big disconnect. There's also a big disconnect in terms of how we talk about this issue more broadly. So for example, we've had a debate, something that Donald Trump has really brought to the fore, but we've had a debate over the past few months about birthright citizenship. That is the fact that the United States is one of only a small handful of affluent countries that grant citizenship to anyone born on US soil, regardless of the legal status of their parents. This has been true for a very long time. It's also true in Canada. But there are many other countries, New Zealand, Australia, France, Britain, that have kind of actually revised their policies on this front. Now, what we've heard a lot of is people, kind of saying, it's insane. It's not as though there are people who are 8.5 months pregnant who are just waiting to spring across the border and give birth. And it's true that's not true. There certainly are some people. There is a birth tourism phenomenon, but it's fairly marginal. What is also true, however, is that 8% of births in the United States are to unauthorized immigrants. Now, that might be a perfectly fine thing. Perhaps that's something that we shouldn't be all that concerned about. But it is actually pretty significant in this sense. Unauthorized immigrants in the United States are extremely poor. And in some cases, they have access to safety net benefits through their children. Sometimes they don't. But the thing is that their children are absolutely part of our national community. The struggles that they face by virtue of the fact that their parents are under severe pressure. Less skilled people in the United States in 2015 face a lot of economic challenges that less skilled people in 1915 did not. These are really, really big issues. And when you have lots of people who think of themselves as very serious people, who don't actually talk about how, gosh, these are legitimate challenges. One thing that's really striking is that in Europe, in social democratic circles, you've long since had people on the left, on the center left, actually talk about how actually integration is kind of a challenge. Actually, at a time when people who work with their bodies, with their backs, are actually just facing huge challenges in all of these kind of post-industrial economies. The left and the right, kind of in Europe, they're way ahead of us in that regard, partly because I would argue there's a kind of romantic quality about the way that Americans think of themselves. Again, this is both on the right and the left, that blinds a lot of people to realizing that we actually have real integration challenges. There's another issue. During the Bush administration, as some of you guys might recall, there was an immigration reform push then, too. And actually, pretty interestingly, back then, the Congressional Black Caucus was actually one of the forces that resisted the immigration reform deal. That hasn't been the case under the Obama presidency. But it's interesting because one of the things that's happened is that you now have more poor Latinos in the United States than you do have poor African Americans. African Americans are about 12% of the US population. And they represent a very significant slice of the electorate. Latinos are now 18% of the population. Now, this is a very diverse population, but it is a population that faces lots of complicated challenges. So I think that, in a way, Trump talks about immigration in a way that, in my view, is totally irresponsible and really misleading in a lot of ways. But he is talking about an issue that if you're looking at the Republican donor class, if you're looking at a lot of the Republican establishment, and if you're looking at the Democratic side too, there is just a big disconnect between some of the legitimate issues that we're facing as a country and the way that people on the elite side of things talk about it.
Yeah, John, I wanted to ask you about this. I think as Rehan was alluding to, there was a time when there was a left-wing argument against too much immigration, right? Unions historically in the United States, maybe partly for racial reasons, but they also figured the more people you have in, it depresses wages. Of course, and you saw a little bit of that with Bernie Sanders, in that debate, an interesting moment where he started to say, well, of course, Wall Street, corporations want unlimited immigration, but the average worker doesn't. Paul Krugman, I remember, has written some pieces which are a little bit skeptical, suggesting that this may be having something to do with the fact that wages, there have been people at various points have talked about, whether African Americans might be mobilized in an anti-immigration politics in some way because of the job pressures they create. And yet, basically, the discourse in the Democratic Party, the dominant discourse, even from labor, basically is, has no time for any of this right now. Why do you think that is? And do you think that's wise for the Democratic Party, or do you think that there may be fissures there that are under the surface?
Well, I think on the surface of it, the reason that within the Democratic Party you don't have that kind of rancorous debate is the demographics of the party itself. At this point, in the latest Pew survey, the Democratic Party is 22% African American. It is about 13% Latino, and that's with Hispanic voters undervoting their population strength almost by half. In places like Texas, Hispanic turnout is literally half what it could be if every registered Hispanic voter actually participated in the system. So Democrats are the party that is multicultural. They're the party whose imperatives are about keeping a multiracial coalition together. So I think that there is a lot of tamping down. What are some real fissures between some of the population groups within the party and among labor, for whom the Democratic Party is really the only lifeline, because it is now an overt plank of the Republican Republican Party to undo the union movement at every level, whether it's public or in the private sector. And so unions have to hang on to the Democratic Party as the one party that still believes in the movement, who still believes in the idea. So the union movement is so important also to electoral politics. Just get out the vote strategies that rely on organizations like the AFL-CIO and SEIU just on the ground. So I think that there are very different dynamics within the parties. The Republican Party is one that only 5% or less, depending on your survey, of African Americans describe themselves as Republicans. The growing population of non-democratic African Americans, Latinos, is independents. And if you add in the leaners, you know, African Americans and Latinos are so overwhelmingly Democratic. At this point, Hispanic voters are where African American voters were in the Eisenhower era. They're about 65-35 Democratic and growing in the Democrats' direction. And on issues, when you ask issue by issue, Hispanics align so closely with the Democratic Party, even if they are Catholic, on issues from everything from abortion to access to health care to do they support the Affordable Care Act. So I think Democrats really see in their future the need to hold together a multiracial coalition in a way that really isn't even an issue for Republicans, because their party really doesn't have enough of a critical mass of non-white voters to really have those arguments within it. So yes, I do think immigration is one issue where, particularly for African Americans, there are some fissures with the party on the idea of unlimited immigration, especially the way the donor class of both parties talk about immigration. A lot of the time when you have sort of big agriculture and sort of big industries that want more lawful migration at the lower skill level in terms of the people who produce our food, basically, what they're talking about is not even a full citizenship model, which actually for Democrats would be electorally beneficial. I think that charge by the right is true. If you just made legal every single unlawful migrant in the country, the vast majority of them, because of their alignment on issues like the social safety net, would be Democrats. But what you have is this desire to legalize the status of people who would not get full citizenship, but who would be locked into sort of a low-wage economy that definitely helps those big businesses, but doesn't even necessarily help those people. So I think that there are a lot of sort of strains within the immigration argument in both of the two parties. But on the Democratic side, I think the demographic imperatives are just bigger, and they're just more important. The Democrats cannot afford, and you can see this in Hillary Clinton going even further than the Obama administration in what she said she would do on immigration reform, that the imperatives are really so powerful because the demographics really live in the Democratic Party. And I think that the peril for Republicans, and this is something that the Republican political class has been warning the party about for a long time, you know, that switch that was flipped for African Americans, where the 35% or so who still hung on to the Republican Party, after Goldwater was the nominee, left. And even the arguments of black Republicans became weakened and diluted so that they didn't feel they could make a cultural case for Republicanism anymore. Donald Trump, the big peril for Republicans is that he might be making that sort of a cultural case against being culturally a Republican, even for Hispanic voters who might be a little bit more conservative. So I think it's a huge peril for that party because it is just so non-diverse.
So
Do you agree with that?
So I would say that when you're looking at Latino voters, it's really helpful to look at households and at voters by income, because basically the Latino population is relatively poor. And you have lots of lower middle income Latinos who will tend to favor a political party that you know, they perceive as being more favorable to their economic interests. So if you're looking at Latino voters and what they consider to be the most important issues for them, immigration is actually not at the top of the list. What is at the top of the list tends to be, you know, what you'd expect: education, the economy, et cetera. If you're looking at the period from about, I think it's 2006 to 2010, you had a decline in the net worth of Hispanic households of about 2/3. And that's for fairly straightforward reasons, because a lot of Hispanic households, you know, they were very heavily invested in housing. They were very heavily concentrated in the regions that were hardest hit by the housing bust. Now, there are a couple of people on the right, like myself, who said that, you know, rather than say, as you have some Republicans say, that the way for Republicans to win Latino voters is to embrace immigration reform, you know, and a sharp increase in Latino immigration, let's say, or an increase in immigration more broadly, you know, it might make sense to talk about the fact that, hey, there is this massive housing bust that devastated the balance sheets of a lot of Latino households. And, we have some plausible path to helping address some of those problems. So I really believe that it's actually, middle-class economic interests that are the key issue. And if you address those issues, then I think that you're going to be able to win more voters from, of Latino origin, African-American origin, et cetera. And I do intend to get back to that, but just to kind of focus on the immigration piece just a little bit longer. I think it's really interesting when you look at the ideological component of the immigration debate and the kind of popular political component. So I'd say that, on the right and the left, you broadly speaking have this argument about immigration, which is pretty straightforward. Basically, immigrants are always beneficial because they're complementary. If I'm a less skilled immigrant, then I can help a high-skilled person in the United States work longer hours, and so the GDP pie grows, and so that means that we can then, and maybe there are going to be some people who are harmed, some people who benefit more, but then we can basically parcel that out through taxes and transfers. The trouble is that even if you're looking at the best gold standard evidence, which finds there might be some slight benefit for natives, there is a negative impact on previous immigrants. But politically, the thing is that previous immigrants, they want to let their relatives come join them in the United States. They strongly favor family unification policies. So it's not as though if you tell them, hey, more immigration is going to hurt you as an immigrant, it's going to suppress your wages to some degree. Well, that's not quite how people think about this. There really is this kind of dimension of kind of straightforward ethnic politics. But there is a big gap between the ideological idea and the political coalition behind immigration reform, because the political coalition for it is to basically expand immigration from the sources that current immigrants come from today. If you had a humanitarian immigration policy, let's say, you would say, let's bring in more immigrants from Zambia. Let's bring in more immigrants from Paraguay, not from Mexico, which is an upper middle income country. You wouldn't necessarily bring affluent people from India. You would be bringing the poorest people from the world. And that's actually not how our immigration policy works. So I think that that's kind of an interesting piece of the puzzle. Now, with regard to the African-American electorate, we actually have a cover story in National Review about exactly this subject. And I'd say that here, a lot of Republicans, particularly on the elite side, I think really kind of misunderstand the right way to connect with this constituency. So before 2008 and 2012, you would basically have somewhere between 8 and 12% of the African-American vote going to a Republican candidate since the Reagan era. I mean, it's not since Nixon where you had a substantially kind of higher share of the black vote going to Republicans. But the thing is that if you had gotten to 8 to 12%, you could, and depending on the states in which you get 8 to 12%, you can meaningfully change the outcome of a presidential election because African Americans are very concentrated in very important swing states, Florida, Ohio, Virginia. Getting a bigger share, again, not 30%, not 50%, but getting, let's say, 12%, getting 15%, getting something like that. And what's striking is that when you look at African American voters, actually, you do have say between 15 and 20% of African American voters who might be amenable to a more conservative message on a variety of issues. The problem is that when you have a party that seems reflexively anti-government, or that also on identity grounds seems hostile to black interests, you're simply not going to get that kind of share of the vote. So in a way, what you need to do is kind of detoxify the Republican brand for that constituency, which is very difficult, and I think that's some of what Joy was speaking to. But when you're able to do that, you see what you saw in Ohio, in New Jersey, what you saw in Florida in the early 2000s, you will see a meaningful number of African Americans voting for Republican candidates. And if you start seeing that, if you start seeing a Republican Party that can compete for about 15% of the black vote, you're starting to see an entirely changed electoral picture. And I personally don't think that that's that far off. Now, we can get to the ways that some Republicans are trying to appeal to black voters, which I think are flawed. But perhaps.
And just not even to belabor the point, but I think that one of the big roadblocks to doing that, because I think you do make a good point. In 2004, just a marginal increase in the African American vote combined with a slight decrease in turnout overall among African Americans was enough to help George W. Bush in Ohio, right? So small swings in the African American vote can make a huge difference because, unlike the Republican vote, which is heavily concentrated in rural states with a small number of electoral votes, the Dakotas with 5 and 6 electoral votes to offer, offer, the reason that it's so important to win in these big states and do well with multiracial constituencies is because Democrats tend to have advantage in high electoral vote states like Ohio, where the two compete, but in Florida, that's the name of the game, is these marginal increases among these constituencies. But I would argue, Rehan, that one of the biggest impediments to Republicans getting beyond and getting into even double digits with African Americans is the stylistic and tonal reaction to Barack Obama. I think that it has been entirely tone deaf, that the sort of Republican entertainment class has taken the lead on the tone toward President Obama, and the electorate has tended to reward people who do things like call him a liar from the floor of the Senate, and who take sort of the almost talk radio tack toward him. That's actually been rewarded enough at the electoral level that I think you have seen the party become untenable, not just on policy grounds, but tonally.
Donald Trump, who was a, who was a birther, right?
Who was a
now leading the
birther and is
Republican
being
field.
rewarded for it.
Right.
So I think with the Republican Party, the challenge they're going to face, it's similar to the challenge with Latino voters. There are some issues on which African Americans still remain quite conservative socially, but the problem is that where those voters are going is to non-alignment. You are seeing a rush of African Americans out of the Democratic Party for a lot of reasons, taking for granted other things that are unappealing about the Democratic Party, but where that vote is going is to the independent track, not to Republicans.
Can I ask you just to focus a little more on 2016? I mean, I think Whit Ayers, who's a Republican pollster, said that even if a Republican candidate were to win 60% of the white vote, which would be, I think, higher than anyone except for Reagan in '84, they would still need 30% of the minority vote, right? And Republicans are having, obviously, doing very poorly with African Americans. Maybe, Joy's suggesting, have reached this tipping point with Latinos, have been doing much worse with Asian voters as well. So do you think that a Republican candidate could, let's say a Jeb Bush or a Marco Rubio, could do 30%, and what would it take?
Yes, I do. So when you're looking at 2016, the big thing to understand is that, the Hispanic population is extremely diverse. And even if we're looking just at immigration views, let's say, the views of native-born Hispanics are actually quite different from foreign-born Hispanics. And a point that Joy had raised earlier on is that, a big question is to what extent does the size of a given constituency translate into votes? Now, for obvious reasons, native-born Hispanics vote at substantially higher rates than foreign-born Hispanics. They're far more likely to be citizens, for one thing. And then also, again, if you're looking at it by income, if you're cross-cutting, if you're looking at middle-income native-born Hispanics, that is a constituency that is far more Republican-friendly than let's say, poorer Hispanics. So if you're looking at, for example, Hispanic evangelicals, this is a constituency that Bush did quite well with in 2000 and 2004. So I think that what you really need to do is kind of segment these populations.
Even despite Trump, you think that despite Trump, that those constituencies, middle class, Hispanics, native-born, Hispanic evangelicals, are still open to voting for a Republican presidential candidate?
So I think that if Trump is the nominee, and depending on actually what kind of campaign he runs, we'll see. I mean, the reason why I don't dismiss that possibility out of hand is very simple. In France, you had the National Front, become wildly popular with gay Jewish Parisians. That is not something you would have anticipated, 5 or 6 years ago, but it's something that has happened. I mean, politics is actually a lot more fluid than we like to think. And I think that, Donald Trump, I personally don't think that he would be a good nominee for the Republican Party. But I think that, there are lots of things that people like us on the stage assume about the electorate, and a lot of these assumptions have turned out to be false. So I think that, if Donald Trump does a series of things that I don't think he's likely to do, for example, if he develops some, kind of economically populist platform as opposed to just making economically populist noises, could he win some non-trivial number of, let's say, native-born Hispanics? Certainly. But I think that the key thing to do would be to actually craft an agenda around these issues. And I think that that's the big problem on the Republican side. I think there's a big fixation on personalities rather than a kind of focus on whether or not the party is perceived, whether or not the party is substantively defending middle-class economic interests. And I think that a party that gets that right, will fare well, and it will fare well. It would also see substantial gains with non-white voters.
Well, I mean, and I think a lot of what happens in 2016 depends on the state of the economy, obviously, with a president, a member of his own party, obviously running to succeed him. You want to have an economy that's in pretty good shape. Right now, it's in pretty good shape. And I think for Republicans, a few alarm bells. for what Rehan was suggesting that they need to do. Number one, it is true that the Hispanic community is very segmented and is very diverse, but 2/3 of it is Mexican American. So 2/3 of it is Mexican American. That is the largest single country of origin, second, third, whatever generation. Mexican Americans are 2/3 of the Hispanic cohort. Cuban Americans, who've been the most receptive to the Republican Party, are 5% of the Hispanic electorate. So Republicans do pretty well with them, but not even as well as they used to. If you look at 2012, you actually saw the Democrats win a bare majority of Cuban Americans. But I think the idea among Republicans is to just get a person with an O at the end of their name, get a Hispanic, and that somehow translates into a tonal difference with all Hispanics. Well, Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz are both Cuban American. That doesn't mean that what they are representing to all Hispanics is the same thing, right? A Cuban American and somebody who is of Mexican American or Guatemalan or Colombian American, they have different issues and sort of variances within even the belief systems of all of these demographic groups. Now, the most recent sort of big poll that was done in Florida by Ben Dixon Associates, which is sort of the gold standard pollster in Florida that really digs into the Hispanic electorate, found that on ideology, when they parsed these different groups, they overwhelmingly favored, for instance, healthcare. Well, a central plank of whoever the Republican nominee is going to be is the repeal of healthcare reform, which has had a disproportionate impact on households of color. And where you have, particularly in southern states, you have the withholding of the Medicaid expansion, which itself has disproportionately harmed people of color. And when you have states like North Carolina, which is getting closer and closer to being a swing state, it's a state that Barack Obama managed to win in 2008, its fastest growing population is Hispanic. And it's got a large African-American cohort. Now, Republicans can craft whatever policy prescriptions for the middle class they want. Whoever the nominee is, whether it's Donald Trump or Jeb Bush, is going to run on repealing the Affordable Care Act. That is going to have a real-world impact on the ability of whoever that nominee is to win Hispanic and African-American votes. That candidate is going to run on rolling back and repealing whatever it is in the Obama era that offends the base of the Republican Party, which is everything. And so the idea of rolling back the Obama era, well, that's not going to help you gain African-American votes. So I think that the Republican Party, sure, they can go in and say, we are the party that can raise your wages. I think that will be a powerful message to white working class voters. The Republicans already do very well with white working class voters. It's Democrats that have a deficit there. So I think the challenges for the Republican Party are significant. And if they're significant now, they become much more significant in 2020 when the Ron Brownstein formula of needing, if the if the electorate is 28% non-white, which it was in 2012, Republicans needed to win 60% of the white vote. Romney won 59% and lost by 7 million votes, I think, or 7%. So when you get to an electorate that is essentially becoming more African American and more Latino by 2% every 4 years, so that it was 26% in 2008, it was 28% non-white in 2012. That means that by 2020, Republicans are staring down the maw of a real serious problem if they can't raise their numbers with non-white voters.
Greg Abbott in Texas won a majority of Hispanic voters. This is a state that is where the Hispanic population is very heavily Mexican American. And I think that when we're looking at someone like a Marco Rubio, let's say, I think it's very true that he's Cuban American. He's not Mexican American. Yet it's also true that Barack Obama, who is not the descendant of African American slaves, is someone who nevertheless connected with lots of black voters for a variety of reasons. And that wasn't obvious that he would do so when he first entered the Democratic presidential race in 2007, but it's something that changed. I'm not saying that Rubio is necessarily a cure-all for the Republican Party, not at all. And I don't think that merely nominating a Hispanic candidate, in fact, I actually think the opposite. I think that, I agree that's a mistake that Republicans make. I think the key is actually focusing on substantive economic issues. But I think that if you do that, another thing to keep in mind is that the Hispanic electorate has actually swung back and forth quite sharply. Sean Trendy has observed that when you look at the Hispanic electorate, it has moved roughly in the same direction as the white electorate, only more sharply in each election. So I think that not that you're making this claim, but I think the notion that the Hispanic electorate is somehow fixed is not quite right. So, if we're looking at Mexican Americans, for example, Mexican Americans in California and Texas vote in sharply different ways, and they also face sharply different economic conditions. For example, in Texas, Mexican Americans are disproportionately working class. They would have benefited from the Medicaid expansion that Greg Abbott opposed or many of them would have. But of course, many of them nevertheless voted for Greg Abbott.
And
So
you
I
have to
think that's
also
pretty
remember
striking.
that in Texas, the undervote of Hispanics is probably the largest undervote in the country, meaning that the turnout is so low that if that turnout had been full-fledged, right, if Hispanic voters in Texas had actually voted their population share,
Yes.
that would have turned out very different.
It's also a lot of the non-citizen Hispanic population also is Mexican. It's disproportionately Mexican. So when we're talking about that 2/3 number too, for example, Puerto Ricans might represent a quite small slice, but they represent a bigger slice of the citizen population. So I mean, there are a lot of
In
subtleties
Florida,
to this.
Right. I want to ask you, Joy, about Hillary Clinton. You were talking earlier about the fact the Democratic Party has moved left. Hillary Clinton has been moving left too, right? So I guess there are a couple of different ways that people look at this, right? There's the one argument you hear is that, well, this is where Hillary Clinton always was in her gut, right? But she had to do this New Democrat thing because that was what Bill Clinton and those guys wanted. But this is now coming back to who she really was all along, right? The other argument is that would be that she doesn't really have any core at all, really, and she moved to the New Democratic position. Now she's moved to the left, but that. You hear this from Sanders people, but the fact that she's getting all this money from Wall Street, super PAC, rich stuff, means that at the end of the day, you can't really trust her. What's your analysis of what kind of president Hillary Clinton would actually be, and how good a guide her campaign policies this time around are to that? Do you think she'd be a more left-wing president than Barack Obama?
I think that because the Obama era has moved the Democratic Party to the left, I think that Hillary Clinton is going where the party is, and that's smart from a political perspective. Hillary Clinton is a fascinating character to me. She's had one of the longest and sort of most complicated character arcs of any modern politician, right? She starts out as this conservative, in a conservative household, campaigning for Barry Goldwater in Illinois, and then she goes to college and has this real sort of liberal feminist awakening and becomes a supporter of Ed Brooke, the liberal African-American senator from Massachusetts, and she really becomes a liberal, dives into presidential campaigns with her new boyfriend, then later husband Bill, and they really worked within the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, but they also supported Carter, who, by the way, when he ran, was not running as a liberal. He was actually running to correct the party back to the right. He was running as an evangelical, Bible-believing Christian, and the liberals at the time, they had something called ABC, anybody but Carter. Like, they'd take anybody except for this, what they saw as somebody too far to the right. So Hillary Clinton has been a little bit all over the map, but if you look at her personal advocacy, it's been in a very classic progressive vein. The work she did with legal aid, the work she did helping sort of migrant workers, et cetera, in Arkansas, she's sort of a classical sort of progressive in that sense. But I think politically, for one thing, I think Hillary Clinton is unfairly tagged with whatever it is Bill Clinton did and believed in the 1990s. When she, as the first lady, she already offended the sensibilities of Americans by wearing pantsuits and trying to have healthcare reform under our auspices, right? So the idea that she would be a forceful policy advocate against the policies of her husband, it seems kind of absurd. It's a modernist reading of what was happening in the real world in the 1990s. She was the first lady. She wasn't doing policy. So to the extent that we really understand what she thinks about those policies, which were to the right of where many Democrats are now on things like criminal justice reform, even the healthcare reform was basically the Bob Dole plan, essentially, in the end, that was considered too liberal when Barack Obama did it. So it's hard to know whether her core is further to the right or further to the left. I think she is a hawk. I think on matters of war and peace, she's definitely to the right of President Obama. But on matters of sort of the social contract, I think she is sort of a classic progressive, and I think she would govern in the spirit of the party as it elected her. And I think one of the things people criticize about the Clintons is the sort of transactional nature of their politics. But one of the reasons Bill Clinton was so popular during his presidency is that he did sort of take the temperature and the pulse of his base and of the American people and say, I'll do that. I'll do what it is that the people who brought me here want me to do. And I think that is good politics in a lot of ways. When Barack Obama has gotten in trouble with his base, it's when he has tried to sort of go around what the base of his party wanted and try to make deals with the other side. And that has been sort of not received well, I think, by the base of the Democratic Party. So I think that Hillary Clinton would be in the Barack Obama mold in terms of policy. I think on foreign policy, she'd probably be to his right. But I think on domestic policy, obviously, Hillary Care means that she would defend and protect and expand the Affordable Care Act. But I think at this point, because of where the party is, the changes on domestic policy would continue to be to the left.
Do you see, I mean, it's one of the things that's really striking to me is there are a series of issues that used to terrify Democrats,
Yeah.
right? Gun control, terrified. Remember Al Gore against George W. Bush? You know, Bush talks about Columbine and says the only thing we need to do is change people's hearts, and Gore says, I entirely agree, right? Criminal justice also terrified Democrats, right? You know, and yet, as the Democratic Party moves to the left on gun control, on environmental issues, on criminal justice, on LGBT rights, do you see on not showing much concern for the way that entitlements could deal with the budget deficit, do you see any dangers there, that there are issues that Democratic Party moving to the left at its base, maybe pushing the Democrats into a place where they could face a backlash with in a general election?
Well, I mean, I think with older voters, it's become increasingly a challenge for the Democratic Party, particularly with white voters over 60. It's become a challenge. But I think Democrats are really looking toward Gen X and younger voters, and in the future, and those voters are substantially to the left of where the center of the party has been since the 1990s. And I think that you do have a truly resurgent left. One of the things that I really do find fascinating about this moment in history is that the set-aside left, the left that was pushed out of the spotlight, in large part by Bill Clinton, the old Mario Cuomo, Jesse Jackson wing of the party, decided during the Obama era that they were not interested in the kind of compromises and triangulation that characterized holding on to a Democratic White House. They took those risks, they pushed this president to the left, and he was still successful electorally. And I think that has emboldened the liberal wing of the party. It is still, within at least the Bernie Sanders part of it, an older, sort of whiter part of the party, but it is clearly resurgent. And I think with like the grandkids of Bernie Sanders' generation, it's real. And I think that even among young conservatives, the social issues are starting to lose their saliency. So I think Democrats are less afraid. And then I just think that the horror and the sort of shock of things like Sandy Hook have forced a lot of Democrats, just as a matter of conscience, to say that they're going to have to embrace some issues like gun control that, by the way, Bill Clinton put forward in the 90s, that Ronald Reagan embraced in terms of the Brady Bill.
But Clinton suffered for them, I mean, in 1994 after, right? I mean, the Brady Bill.
I mean, I think there were a lot of reasons that the Democrats got swept out in 1994. The Brady Bill was probably part of it, but I don't know that there's an empirical proof that it was gun control that sunk the Democrats in 94. I think it was a lot of issues. But I think Democrats have started to retract themselves from the sort of fear-based policy making that has just characterized them since the post-Lyndon Johnson era.
Right. And Rehan, when you look at the Democratic Party's move left, where do you see the vulnerabilities in a general election?
Well, I think that when you have a successful political coalition, what happens is that the political coalition grows more expansive, and then it has to become more contradictory. Managing the tensions within that bigger, more expansive coalition just becomes harder and harder. So there was this little moment when President Obama, in a State of the Union address, made what I thought was actually a pretty modest and not entirely unreasonable proposal, which was to claw back some tax benefits for college savings that primarily benefited middle-income and upper-middle-income households, and use that to finance another tax credit that would have benefited a broader swath of the population. Not that big a deal. There was an immediate and fierce backlash from Democrats, and then that proposal was pretty much immediately abandoned. Now, that proposal didn't have much of a hope of getting passed legislatively, but regardless, the White House had to disavow it. When you go back to 2013, shortly after the president's reelection, when we were debating what to do about the so-called fiscal cliff, it's pretty interesting to see that Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi were both pressing to ensure that the tax increases that were going to kind of be a part of this fiscal cliff deal would only affect households earning not over $250,000, but over $1 million. Because, you know, for Charles Schumer and for Nancy Pelosi, they have a lot of constituents who are upper middle income, frankly rich, and who did not want to bear any tax increase. When you're talking about universal child care, when you're talking about a whole slew of different, quite expensive social programs, you are going to need more tax revenue. When we look to Denmark, when we look to other Northern European social democracies, the really striking difference between them and us in terms of how they tax is that they tax middle-income people at much, much higher levels, and in exchange, middle-income people get a whole suite of social benefits. So I think that this is a very big dilemma for Democrats. The question is, are you willing to put your money where your mouth is? It's certainly true that in the kind of young left-of-center intelligentsia, you have a lot of people who are very enthusiastic about ideas that had been very popular in the 1970s, and then you had a generation of Democrats who were very chastened when they saw that actually middle-income Americans were not all that enthusiastic about some of these ideas. And I think that we may well be seeing a replay of some of those dynamics.
Which ideas in particular you think about were popular in the 70s
Well,
and then
one thing I'll just kind of note for all of you guys. So I think that actually the politics of Obamacare are going to be a very, very big deal in 2016, but not in the way that conservatives would have expected. So one thing that right-wingers like me are a little alarmed by is that when you're looking at the Republican debates, if you're looking at kind of a lot of this conversation you've had among Republican candidates, actually very little of it has been about Obamacare. And I think that there are some conservatives, like myself, who believe that, basically you have a lot of Republicans who, they'll keep saying that they're committed to repealing and replacing Obamacare, but they kind of realize what a heavy lift that is, and they also realize how politically impossible it is to take away a benefit once it's been extended. Yet it's also true that you still have pretty consistently narrow majorities of the public that disapprove of the president's healthcare law, of the Affordable Care Act. Now, that could mean lots of different things. I could disapprove of it because, let's say, I want single payer, but you have a large number of people who disapprove of it, and so it's interesting to kind of dig in. So recently, Sylvia Burwell, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, said that her goal was for there to be 10 million enrollees in the health insurance marketplaces, the exchanges, by the end of 2016. Now, as recently as June of 2015, the Congressional Budget Office projected that there would be 23 million people on the exchanges. Now, the best estimates we have is that there will be, and this is from, kind of sober analyst types, that you'll have maybe 12.2 million enrollees on the exchanges. So it kind of makes sense why Sylvia Burwell would say, it's going to be really hard, we're sweating it out, but we want to get to 10 million. Because, well, if you get to 12, then you've won, right? But again, the expectation was that you're going to have far more enrollees. Who isn't enrolling on the exchanges? Well, the low-income folks who are in the exchanges. So the Medicaid expansion was meant to kind of take care of most of the kind of low-income households. There was a narrow slice of kind of low to middle-income households who were going to be, who were in this slice between, let's say, 100 and 138% of poverty. So these are the people who've signed up in very large numbers because they get very generous Obamacare subsidies, so they can afford these actually pretty expensive policies. But then above that, the middle-class uninsured that Obamacare was supposed to win over in a lasting, durable way, they are not signing up. They are risking remaining uninsured because they find these policies so expensive and so unattractive. Now, I have my own thoughts about kind of what's a way a Republican might want to square the circle. But politically, that's pretty interesting. And I would argue that whoever is the next president, they're going to be consumed with the fact that Obamacare has had a lot of kind of ironic side effects. It has not worked as its architects had intended in all kinds of ways. It's worked in some ways. You have lots of low-income people who've gained coverage, which is a huge moral victory for folks on the left. That's what they wanted to see. But the thing is, they actually made a much broader political case about how it would benefit middle-income people in a palpable way. The promise that the president made is that it would actually lower insurance premiums. And that actually hasn't played out. So I think that, again, I kind of feel like Republicans, they do recognize that if you're seen as taking away an existing benefit for people, that is very dangerous politics. But on the other hand, there's a lot of discontent that's been created by that piece of it alone. And then, so shoring up, quote unquote, Obamacare the way Hillary Clinton, wants to. So what does she want to do? She wants to repeal the so-called Cadillac tax, which is one of the key ways that Obamacare was designed to kind of constrain healthcare costs throughout the system. So get rid of that tax, also a big revenue source. She also wants to make Obamacare policies far more generous to lower middle income families. It's also pretty expensive, and that also might lead to greater utilization. There are lots of things that are happening here, and it's an open question of how she intends to pay for them. If she intends to pay for them through huge middle-class tax increases, the math will add up on that. As to how popular that will be, that's an open question. And I think that in a way, that other shoe has yet to drop.
Well, and if I may, one of the other, I think, big shoes that has yet to drop on the Affordable Care Act specifically is the 5 million people or so who the system was designed to also cover, but who are having the Medicaid expansion benefit withheld from them by states. And in states like North and South Carolina, this is galvanizing a quite robust and interesting change in a coalition. So I was just in North Carolina, where the most recent 5 NAACP branches that have opened up in the state of North Carolina are all rural and are all almost entirely white. Because you're now seeing the ripple effect of the failure of the resistance, essentially, just a political resistance to expanding the Affordable Care Act, which is especially true in southern states. It's true in Republican-controlled states, where the withholding of that benefit, refusing to take that federal subsidy for the state, and scrambling to find other ways to cover not the very poor who can be covered by Medicaid proper, but the sort of next level up. Because the other studies have shown that states who have actually taken the Medicaid expansion, it actually does have a ripple effect in the next group up. Because these are people who are working, who actually have jobs, but who do not have this additional benefit of health care. It's worked very well in Kentucky, that expansion sort of ripples all the way up through the private marketplace. So I think one of the other interesting thing that's going to take place in 2016 is you have a lot of sort of unexpected states that are now really litigating this question of whether or not taking the Affordable Care Act expansion and not covering 5 million Americans who would otherwise get it is going to be a real issue on the ballot. And it's going to be an issue in places like Florida, which is a very important state, and in North Carolina, again, a state that is coming very close to being a swing state. So I think Republicans assume that they can make the argument that the Affordable Care Act hasn't worked, when in very fundamental ways you have more than a dozen states that are actively undermining it. And so would it work if it was fully participated in, rather than having this ideological refusal to play, essentially, by a lot of Republican states?
So I know that Peter is going to want to move on, but I'll just make one point about the Medicaid, which is that in the United States, Medicaid represents a huge part of the way that we fight poverty in this country. But the funny thing is, in Oregon, there was this Oregon Medicaid experiment, and they've kind of done a lot of different things to see what happened when they extended Medicaid to a kind of larger group of beneficiaries. And what they found is that for these new beneficiaries, they valued $1's worth of Medicaid benefits at about 20 cents in terms of cash. That is, they would have much rather had an increase in cash benefits than Medicaid. But the reason why I think Joy is right, why there's enormous political pressure to expand Medicaid, is actually, not, I would argue, not primarily because of the Medicaid beneficiaries themselves, the rank-and-file voters. It is because hospitals, are enormously politically influential. They employ large numbers of people. They employ physicians. And actually, these large hospital groups, they badly want this money. For a lot of poor people, they would rather have maybe a high earned income tax credit. They would rather have high direct benefits for when they kind of stumble, any number of other benefits that allow them to be the kind of masters of their own fate. But the thing about a Medicaid expansion is that you can only spend that money if you are redeeming that money through someone in the medical sector. So the politics of it are indeed very potent, as Joy pointed out.
Yeah, I mean, the politics are potent, but I think that, I am a bit dubious of the claim that given the choice between having an insurance card and being able to take your child to the hospital, people would prefer to have a once-a-year tax credit. I think that's something that has become kind of...
$5,000 for a poor family can make a huge difference in their life.
Well, the reality is that a one-time benefit in the real world gets spent out immediately. When George W. Bush did tax refunds as the form of a $600 credit to families, what wound up happening is that it didn't help them over the course of the year. In that one moment, they paid a lot of back bills, but it didn't change their financial condition. And I would argue that in states that don't have the Medicaid expansion, in Florida, there was one county that tried this experiment with the federal government where they said, we will do an experimental version if HHS will allow us. And they did it. It largely failed, but one of the reasons it failed was that the only way that the Republican legislators would allow that experiment to go forward was if it was tied to an HMO. And I think any of us who have ever had an HMO know that the experience of dealing with an HMO is not pleasant. And so it wound up being a more cumbersome system than had they simply gotten the Medicaid expansion.
I'd welcome going back and forth on this. And I think that the key point that I'm trying to make is that when you have a benefit that can only be redeemed by medical providers versus a benefit that goes directly to poor people, there are lots of poor people who would choose to go to a different way. But of course, when the providers are politically influential, you see a different story.
Let's open it up to the audience. Do we have microphones going around, or are we just going to do it without microphones? I think I see one coming around. All right. Go ahead, sir. With glasses. I think just hold on 1 second. The microphone microphone will get to you in a second.
The conservative gentleman whose name I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm wondering.
Reihan Salam.
Fine, sir. If Trump is the nominee, which seems very unpopular among the other Republican candidates, what will the party do? They seem to be so distancing themselves from him, and yet the other candidates seem to be adopting a lot of what he's saying, particularly with immigration and other things. What would happen? Will it split the party in a serious way, do you
So
think?
first, I actually don't think you see a lot of the other candidates adopting what he's saying. I will say that, again, when you have a political party where only 7% of the kind of Republican Party voters actually favor an increase in immigration, I think that to some extent there's just kind of a natural kind of reversion to the fact that it's a party that's skeptical. But I think that if he's the nominee, I think there will be an absolute meltdown. I think it will be a complete disaster, and I think you will have huge numbers of Republicans who will not support the Republican nominee, who will defect in droves, and I think that it will engender a serious crisis. That's also why I think it's extremely unlikely to happen.
Let's see. Go ahead. In the back? Yeah. Good.
My question goes to both Joy and the other speaker. My question goes to both Joy and the other speaker. I'm curious. I think it's pretty well known to the public who's aware when you see debates and when you see people. Lincoln Chafee is just not a candidate. Jim's gone. You got 9 or 12 people that are unrealistic on the Republican side. Why aren't comments made that say specifically that? I mean, Bernie Sanders is a wonderful Jewish man from Vermont. He's not electable. We know it. You know it. Alabama knows it. Mississippi knows it. I'm not clear why you're not saying things like that. It's just not going to happen.
From the media?
Yeah.
I think that the media, in a sense, made a judgment about Bernie Sanders' electableness, if I can make up a word, and you can see it in the coverage. I think they did not make the same judgment in a lot of ways about Donald Trump. I should say we, since I'm in the media, because Donald Trump has an X factor that no other candidate running has. He's a celebrity. And I think that there was no way of understanding in advance what it would mean when a celebrity ran. If you recall, when Arnold Schwarzenegger first got elected governor of California, there was a mini boomlet among Republicans to change the Constitution to allow him to run for president, because this idea was so intriguing that a celebrity could actually vault over ideological resistance and actually win voters on the other side merely because of his celebrity. And I think Donald Trump has that same potential because he was on a popular TV show not that long ago. He has a celebrity factor that helps him. I think that helps him stay obviously in the media. The fact that he's getting any traction and is in double digits is enticing. And the fact that he rates when he's on television, it just feeds a cycle where he's getting coverage because it's successful. When you put him on the air, your numbers go up. You put him in your article, you get more clicks. So I think that he is feeding a vicious cycle in the media, but he's actually riding a wave that's real. I tend to just not believe this idea that the Trump phenomenon is ephemeral. I think there's something real and underlying going on in a part of the electorate, particularly an anxiety among white working class voters, that bears examination. So I think the media ought to scrutinize more what that's about, what's happening there, because there is somewhat of a Venn diagram with people who are very much for Bernie Sanders and have a lot of anxiety about income inequality and about the way the country runs. The media, it isn't really our job to say who can be elected, because you just never know. I mean, I think a lot of people would have laughed had they been told that Bernie Sanders would be where he is in the polls today, or that Donald Trump would be. So I think you have to watch the phenomenon unfold, and you have to then describe it.
The woman with the glasses? Yeah.
Oh, none of you mentioned the woman vote at all, which I found curious, especially coming after the Planned Parenthood controversy. And Planned Parenthood gives money, as we all know, not for abortions, but through Medicaid. So, for example, in New Hampshire, which recently decided not to fund Planned Parenthood because of the Republican council, the swing vote was a fellow who used to be a Planned Parenthood Republican, but he switched his vote because he wants to get the nomination. And there could be an effect of some women moving over to the Democratic Party because of this, even though more white women, I think, voted for the Republicans last time than voted for the Republicans. And also, the Republicans have become more extreme on abortion. I was shocked at the first debate, not by Trump insulting how women looked physically, but by how almost every Republican said that they would not approve of abortion, even to save the life of the mother. which stunned me. And I think most of them took that view, if I recall. They went down the line. So do you not mention it because you don't think the women's vote is in play at all?
Yeah, I'd be interested in asking both of you that. I mean, it seems to me both of the parties actually have moved to more extreme positions on abortion. I mean, the Republican Party, I also was struck by the difficulty now of even saying in the Republican Party that you support a rape and incest exception. And the Democratic Party, on the other hand, you know, in 1992, Bill and Hillary Clinton were talking about how abortion should be safe, legal, and rare, right? So there was a kind of a certain kind of disapproving tone about abortion, even as the party, of course, wanted to make it legal. That seems to me pretty much gone as well. Raihan, and then I'll go to Joy.
By the way, I don't think that you had every Republican agree that they would not make an exception in the
No.
case of life of the mother.
No, but
Rubio,
Rubio, you know, who's considered maybe, you know, one of the most mainstream and electable candidates, wouldn't come out and say that he supported those exceptions.
A rape and incest exception, which is quite distinct from a life of the mother exception.
Fair enough, right?
And
rape and incest.
I think that what Rubio said is that, you know, he believes, well, first of all, he's favored legislation in the past that included rape and incest exceptions, but, you know, he was articulating a kind of larger goal. I guess I'd very simply say that when you're looking at opinion on abortion among women versus men, actually you have pretty close parallels. You don't see a dramatic divergence. You have a large number of pro-life women, you have a large number of pro-life men, and the numbers are quite similar. Now, when you're talking about, you know, certain constituencies, women for whom abortion rights are their highest priority, their most important issue, I think it's reasonable to say that they are not going to vote for a Republican candidate come 2016. I think that that has been true in many elections in the past, will likely be true in elections in the future. But what is striking is that when you're looking at younger voters, let's say, while they've grown more liberal on, let's say, the question of same-sex marriage, they have not consistently grown more liberal on the question of abortion. There are many reasons, there are many interesting theories as to why that's the case. Part of it relates to kind of the nature of cohort replacement. Opinions on abortion are one issue where the views of parents and children are very tightly correlated, whereas that's not the case with same-sex marriage. And you know, it happens that people who are pro-life had larger families, 30 years ago. So there are lots of reasons why that might be the case, but I think that the Republican Party is going to remain a pro-life party, and I don't think that they're going to suffer for it electorally.
I mean, but I do think that it is true, the saying, nature abhors a vacuum, right? And I think within the Republican Party, there is sort of a scramble now between the various wings of the party for ascendancy. You do have the evangelical wing, which is much more assertive, which I think is pulling the party. It was already to the right on the issue of abortion, but even further to the point where you have a Marco Rubio implying that women were somehow making money, getting financial incentives to use Planned Parenthood abortion services, and sort of saying things that don't even seem tonally correct for someone who's sort of in the establishment wing of the party. I think people who knew of Scott Walker's history in Wisconsin were not surprised that he is a maximalist on the issue of abortion. He always was. It's just he wasn't well known. So in some cases, it's just the public is coming to know some of the already held positions of people. Jeb Bush he's a Catholic, but he's sort of an evangelical Catholic. The Terry Schiavo issue was one in which you sort of saw the maximalist position he took on end-of-life care. So I think it is fascinating to sort of look at the women cohort. I mean, the most obvious sort of selling point, unique selling proposition that Hillary Clinton could be running on, should she choose to do it, which is that she could be historic for women in the same way that Barack Obama was historic for African Americans. She has not played that card as of yet. I think it's a powerful card for her, particularly because when you break down the votes of women, I think Raihan is correct that they aren't all that necessarily different, except in one way, from men on race. If you look at white women vote in substantially similar ways to white men, and married white women vote majority Republican. As a matter of fact, Barack Obama not only lost the white vote, he lost the white women's vote. It's only when you get to women of color that you see the substantial swing toward the Democratic Party, so that African American women, who had 72% turnout, higher than any other demographic group in 2012, are the most Democratic, more so than African American men. And Latino women are much more Democratic than Latino men. So I think when you look at women and even younger people, if you look at younger voters, they break down the way white voters, at least in the white voter cohort, much the way their parents do. But when you go to younger people of color, they swing substantially toward the Democrats. The reason it appears that the younger vote is becoming more and more Democratic is that as you get to these younger and younger cohorts, they are more and more non-white. So that you have a quarter of the students in public school, I think within the next 5 years, will be non-white. So the millennials millennials they're just more minorities in them. And I think among women, single white women are the one constituency where Democrats have a real fighting chance. And single white women are also among the greatest undervote in American politics. Single white women don't vote at nearly the rates of married women. And single white women are our key constituency for Hillary Clinton to activate, because that could boost the gender gap in her favor. So I think you will ultimately see Democrats try to open up a gender gap with Republicans on things like Planned Parenthood. I found it really amazing that in the recent CNN debate, Planned Parenthood didn't even come up. And so in a party that is so dependent on trying to cull particularly more single white women and cull more people of color, that debate to me represented a weird sort of moment for the Democratic Party. It was just anachronistic. It just wasn't addressing what the party is today.
One last question. Go ahead, in the back. Yes.
I saw something on my phone today which said that Wall Street was trying to get Bloomberg to run so that Trump wouldn't get the nomination. What do you think of that possibility?
I think it's pretty unlikely that he'd want to run unless he believed that he had a reasonable shot at winning. I think that if there were some scenario in which Hillary Clinton is the Democratic nominee, but she's somehow damaged, in some kind of unanticipated way, and if Trump is the Republican nominee, could Michael Bloomberg then step in? I'm skeptical that he'd want to take that on, but it's certainly true. Well, so there would be lots of logistical difficulties. You'd have to get on the ballot in all 50 states, et cetera, but he certainly has the resources to do that. And I think it's also true that he has certainly contemplated something like a presidential bid in the past. So while I think it's pretty unlikely, I don't think it's impossible, but the thing is that a series of very unlikely things have to happen, including, let's say the nomination of Donald Trump as the Republican nominee.
No, I think it's fascinating that Wall Street, which put so much money and energy into growing the Tea Party movement for its own benefit, really, to elect more Republicans, now sees itself as sort of the chief victim of the rise of the Republican right. Now they must stop this at all costs, even if it means recruiting the pro-gun control former mayor of New York City. I guess
I would disagree with that characterization. When we talk about Wall Street as an entity, I mean, it's a pretty big, diffuse, amorphous thing, right? So there may well have been some Wall Street donors who donated to Tea Party candidates, and my guess is that they tend to still favor Tea Party candidates today, whereas the kind of people who'd be enthusiastic about a Bloomberg bid, I think it's safe to say that those were the people who were opposing Tea Party candidates all along.
So I want to just end with a very quick question for both of you, a prediction. So I want you each to tell me who's going to win the Democratic and Republican nominations, and then who's going to win the presidency. Raihan?
That's just cruel.
Hillary Clinton will win the Democratic nomination, Marco Rubio will win the Republican nomination, and Marco Rubio will be elected president.
Joanne?
I am a Rubio skeptic because I actually lived in Florida for 14 years and was underwhelmed, I have to be honest. I think Hillary Clinton definitely wins the Democratic nomination. The Republican is so fluid and insane. I have no idea who will win the Republican nomination, but I would say the demographics are tilted so heavily in the Democrats' favor, just on the racial and ethnic demographics. It would surprise me if there was any other outcome other than President Hillary Clinton.
Please join me in thanking Joy-Ann Reid, Raihan Salam, for a wonderful conversation. And Joy-Ann will be signing books outside afterwards.
Thank you. Thanks for that last question. Putting us on the spot.
Yeah.
That was really fun.
Yeah, no, it was great.